The Journeyman Chapter 3. The room in Cinnamon John's inn was done. Mr. Toppin and his apprentice had worked day after day, and no one had asked them any questions. Sour milk had been supplied for their paints, and from peddlers fresh from the cities. Mr. Toppin had bought packets of dry colors to replenish his dwindling store. They had begun their work when the day was young and finished when sunset filtered through the wide west windows. Then they had gone down to the kitchen to sit at the long table and eat and talk with other travelers. Most apprentices were relegated to the hearth with a bowl of scalded milk or bean porridge and a brown crust. But Jared had been privileged from the start, sitting at the same table with the men and sharing the same fare. After supper, Mr. Toppin would linger by the fire. It was a time when conversation that somehow patched together the ends of the earth was exchanged. To sit by the hearth of the oven. Oh my goodness. To sit by the hearth of an inn in those days was to have an ear to the world, for there was not a passing traveler without some whit of news. Jared would more often climb the stairs to the loft and, pulling the quilt over his shoulders, snuggled down to sleep in its folds. The sense of happiness that pervaded him made him feel warm and secure. Beauty was taking shape under his hands and before his eyes. At last he could be part of all the beauty that God had given the world. The lilacs coming into their darkly purple and deeply scented bloom. The majesty and music of words he read from the Bible when he went to meeting on Sunday. On that day alone, out of the whole week, and for all the hours of it, the journeyman painter and his apprentice laid down their brushes. As they worked together day after day, Jared learned how the work was done. Sometimes he was clumsy. Sometimes he made mistakes which took a long time for their undoing. But through it all, he felt a skill coming into his fingers. Now the stencil never slipped under his hands, for he knew how to hold it. Now he never loaded too much paint on his brushes, for he knew how to dip them. Now he never mixed shades amiss, for he knew the right proportions for the colors they were using. After the walls had been washed with solid color and the stencils cut, they had worked for the next few days with cord and chalk, spacing the designs, marking on the walls where each one should go. When that had been done, they stood in the center of the room and saw how the finished walls would look. Art, Jared, Mr. Toppin said then, is to do just enough to satisfy, just enough to intrigue. The spacing of your stencil reveals your skill more than anything else you do. Crowd your designs, and you have bound the wings of fantasy. Space them well, and you give it full flight. Jared nodded. He understood that. It explained why, when he lay on his back by his father's brook and looked up at the sky, he saw more beauty in the budding branches of the early spring than in the leafy foliage of summer. It was the beauty of space. The space, as Mr. Toppin had said, gave freedom to thought. There's this word that I didn't know what it meant. It's called a frieze, Frieze. The definition is a decorative horizontal band as along the upper part of a wall in the room. It is a flat member or face, broken by triglyphs and often enriched with figures and other ornaments of sculpture. So I think it's something like what you would see with crown molding at the top of a room, but maybe where there's like a flat space that's kind of framed with molding on either side of it. Sometimes it had engravings or sculptures, and sometimes it was just flat. But the frieze, just below the ceiling, now that is different, Mr. Toppin went on, for we must hold the design in a frame, as it were, so we depend upon the frieze to do that. We must also frame the view from each window, and there again our frieze will do it. But within the frieze, that's where space counts. Jared had held one end of the cord while Mr. Toppin had taken the measuring line and chalk. Carefully, he made indications where each stencil should lie, so that its relationship with every other one in the room would be balanced and serene. Jared's fingers began to itch for the brushes. So long a time it seemed they were working with intangible things. So long a time the room was no more than yellow walls with chalk dots. But Mr. Toppin saw the walls as if they were done. "Sir, when shall we really start to work?" Jared asked hungrily, after nearly a week had gone by. "Work?" Mr. Toppin looked surprised. "But what do you think we have been doing?" "Getting things ready." Mr. Toppin gazed at Jared, and his eyes, warm as they were, had something to them that seemed to go through the boy's thin body. "Getting ready is the biggest part of any job, and the hardest, Jared," he answered slowly. "Have you ever seen a building, the foundation, or the house a building? Have you ever seen a house a building? Like being built. The foundation first, the heavy frame, the ridge pole, and all the thought beforehand? These are the things you do not see when it is finished, but you'd have no house without them. Lay your foundation true and firm, my boy. Prepare your work well. The rest all but does itself." Jared said nothing more. He felt rebuked, not by Mr. Toppin's words, but by his own brashness. He must learn to wait, among all else that he was learning, to lay the groundwork like a true master, to seek beauty through the eye of his mind, instead of turning to the fortuitous skill of his fingers. When in patience and humility he saw that beauty dwelt secure, he could be confident that it would reproduce itself, and by its own force. Fingers and brush would be the mediums then, not the prime actors. "Now, lad, we'll mix our colors." Mr. Toppin moved over to the makeshift table and opened the different packets of dry powders, pouring them into earthen jars with glazed interiors. Then he added to them the right amounts of scoured milk to give a pliant mixture. "There's a secret with colors," he explained. "If you want to make people happy just by the seeing of them, use colors that have a kinship with each other. People won't always know it's your colors. They'll think they just happen to feel happy, but it doesn't matter." He swung around from his mixing and looked out the window. "There's not an artist since the beginning of the world that hasn't had the same teacher, nature. For there's not a day in the year but that the purest beauty anyone can see is in the work that God made. Look there now, Jared, and tell me what colors you see." Jared moved nearer the window. It was open, and a breeze, fragrant with springtime, blew in on him. His eyes rested on the green pasture where 2 colts were frolicking, then on a nearby window where the green was mottled with the bright yellow of dandelions, then on across brown tree trunks, the newly turned earth to the blue haze of distant hills, melting into the azure reaches of the sky. "Green, Mr. Toppin," Jared said, "and gold, blue, and brown, perhaps a sort of color like bricks before they are kilned." "Ochre, we'll call that last," Mr. Toppin added. "Good enough, Jared. And those colors bear kinship with each other. Mix any 2 together, and you'll get another one. Now try again. If you were looking eastward across those hills, and it were early dawn, what colors would you see heralding the sun?" "In winter or in summer, sir?" "Both. Tell me winter first." Jared half closed his eyes to see the flow of dawn over the mountains near his home, to see it as he had so often seen it, shivering in the cold winds of January. "White in the east, then lifting to silver," Jared began, "then warmed as the silver turns to gold. Suddenly the sun itself, like a golden wave, splashes over the world." "Now summer?" "Oh," Jared said, breathing deeply, and the memory of the warmth of a summer dawn made his lean body shed its tenseness. "Here we begin with gold. The gold turns into orange, then crimson. The light glows with scarlet, and the earth looks warm and rich. Then such a globe of fire comes over the mountains as makes the corn in the fields draw some of the color into its cobs, and the fruits on the trees borrow a tinge. Mr. Toppin slapped his hands on his knees and laughed heartily. That's right, Jared, and we could go on and on. Think of your flamboyant trees in autumn, the subtle bending of a cock pheasant's plumage, the pattern of the sky repeated on a bluebird's breast. We'll take our cue from nature, holding well to the colors that hold well with each other. They mixed their paints, and the next day commenced their work. Mr. Toppin did most of it, the different friezes and all the intricate designs. Jared held paint pots, cleaned the brushes, and rubbed the stencil edges free of hardened paint. When Mr. Toppin needed both hands, Jared held the stencil firmly to the wall and watched the deft moves of the brush as the design was filled in. With some patterns, one stencil was laid upon another for the overlaying of color. Their progress was slow, for Mr. Toppin was a careful craftsman, made doubly so by experience, placing his patterns precisely and laying the paint wisely. After many days, Mr. Toppin turned the stencils and the brushes over to Jared, leaving the bit of wall behind the door for him to do. Jared was happy, and his heart beat so hard and fast that he could hear nothing else. He held the stencil firmly as he had held it for so many days for Mr. Toppin. But try as he would, he could not keep his hand from trembling. The stencil slipped off its line, and an ugly smudge of paint marred the lacy clarity of the pattern. "Oh, sir, see what I have done?" Jared cried out, and his voice broke with chagrin and disappointment. Mr. Toppin crossed the room and stood by Jared. Jared raised his arm to shield his head from the blow he dreaded. Remember how his father hit him when he was mad? Yeah. There was silence for a moment, and a robin singing outside in an apple tree seemed to Jared like a cry of pain, for his world had darkened so. Then Mr. Toppin's hand closed firmly around Jared's wrist. He moved the bowed arm until it hung straight and stiff at the boy's side. "Stand like a man, Jared, and face another like an equal." So the stencil slipped. "You've held it firm enough for me days past." "My fingers were trembling, sir. I couldn't hold the stencil still." "Don't blame your fingers. It was not they who trembled first, was it?" he asked kindly. "Come, Jared. You're man enough to face your work and to do it. Take the stencil and lay it for pattern next in line, straight and true. You can do it." Jared picked up the stencil and held it to the wall. He dipped his brush and poised it for a moment over the space. A calm had come over him, and with it a feeling of power as he rose to do what Mr. Toppin expected him to do. Mr. Toppin stood by him until every curving line of the pattern had filled in, and the stencil removed from the wall. The stencil was there, solid and simple, and as true as any other in the room. "There's not a better one in the whole room," Mr. Toppin said approvingly. "Now bring me my knife and some rags, and mix me a drop or two of yellow wash. I'll tend to the slip while you go on laying the lower wainscot." It was not easy to correct the line that had wavered, but Mr. Toppin worked quietly until he had done it. Then he called Jared to him and explained the method. "You'll not slip another line, Jared. There's never any need to, once you've seen it that way." Jared smiled up at him. "I know that, sir." It was the end of May, and the tide of spring had nearly met that of summer when the room was finished. Cinnamon John could now be brought to it for his first glimpse of the decorated walls, and the party he had planned to celebrate them would soon be in full swing. Mr. Toppin and Jared stood by the door, and their eyes encircled the room with a last loving glance. Mr. Toppin turned to Jared, patting his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Jared, I've told you a mint of things you'll probably forget, but the words don't matter if the doing has become part of you. One more thing I'll say." Yes, sir?" Jared looked up expectantly. "We think the room is fine because we did it, and because we've lived in it all these weeks. And because we've done our best, it may be that others won't think so." "Oh, Mr. Toppin, but how could—" Jared began. Mr. Toppin waved his hand in the air. "Let it be, boy. Let it be. Can't you see that it doesn't matter what the world thinks if you've done your work the best you knew how to do? Amazement was written wide on the boy's face. Then a smile gave it place. Yes, sir, I do see what you mean. I doubt if there's much more I can teach you after this, Jared, but we'll work together on every job as man and man. He turned and pushed the door open. Now to find Cinnamon John. It was the hour before sunset, and the light was its warmest and purest when they brought Cinnamon John up to the room. The big man stepped over the threshold with awe in his footsteps. He approached the center of the room as reverently as if it were a shrine, and then he stood still. His breath was short and husky. He brushed one of his big hands across his eyes as if to assure himself that he could not brush away what he was seeing. He turned slowly and took in the whole room, then turned again and took in every detail of the work. Do you think he likes it? Jared whispered excitedly to Mr. Toppin as they stood in the doorway. Mr. Toppin inclined his head slightly and laid a finger on his lips. Jared understood that, for the moment, or these many moments, he would have to remain as still as the brushes in their pot. Cinnamon John was embraced by yellow walls, whose glow stirred an answering glow within him. His eyes were raised to the frieze near the ceiling, a series of blue waves rising and curving, falling into fragments of foam. Round the room the frieze went rising, falling, breaking, a repetitive pattern, but with such movement and grace that Cinnamon John saw himself as the captain he never became, sailing the uncharted seas of fancy. The same frieze, but in smaller detail, broke around each window in the room and the two doorways. His eyes dropped to the wainscot. Here was a row of pineapples, perfect in form, green with a base of green and a tuft of foliage above them. Wherever the wainscot went, all around the room, the pineapples rested on it, not too closely spaced, but saying clearly enough to everyone that beheld them, "Here is such hospitality as never flowed in any portion of the globe." In the panels between the windows were the graceful sweeping boughs of laden fruit trees, blue trees with fruits of red and green, each tree patterned alike. There were spaces where flowers bloomed, but exotic flowers such as no untraveled eye had ever seen. On the wide panels over the fireplaces, at each end of the room, Mr. Toppin had laid one design and no other, and the spacing of it had been decided on only after long hours of deliberation. It was an urn filled with flowers, but only those flowers that bloomed in the east and west alike, a tulip, a lily, a carnation, and a spray of lilac. On either side of the urn was a bird of paradise, like no bird that had ever taken wing from the earth. The proud head was raised high, the delicate feet were firmly set, the long tail swept in a magnificent curve down the corner of the panel. With the birds and with the flowers, there was that same imposing of colors that made a prism of a plaster wall. Cinnamon John's eyes had traversed the room. They came now to rest on the big man and the reedy boy standing in the doorway. Cinnamon John wagged his head, and the broad smile that all his friends knew so well started to wreathe his face. He crossed over to them and took Mr. Toppin's hand in both of his. "I've sailed many a sea in my time, but never a one that brought me to a land such as this," he said, shaking the journeyman painter's hand warmly. "I knew you were a good one, Toppin, when I asked you to do it, but I never knew you'd do such a good job. You've earned your silver dollars and the lifelong commendation of Cinnamon John." "Thank you, John," Mr. Toppin said. "It's been the best job I've ever done, but that's not to say I won't do a better one someday." Great were the preparations the next day for the party that evening, the party that was to show the newly decorated room to the countryside. All day long, the odors from the kitchen proclaimed the good things that were being baked and mulled and simmered. The children went to the fields for branches and boughs to deck the lower rooms of the inn. Cinnamon John himself waxed the floor of the upper room, as he would let no one else into it. Mr. Toppin took himself to the woods, striding up the hill shortly after breakfast, and not striding down again until near supper time. Jared busied himself cleaning brushes and stencils and paint pots, packing the kit and storing it in the saddlebags. He brought the horses in from pasture and curried them well. The 2 mares were so fat from the weeks of grazing that Jared wondered if their saddle girths would go around them. He swept the saddles free of the dust that had seeped over them while they hung in the barn, then rubbed all the leather with tallow. Everything was in readiness for the morning. By mid-afternoon, the fiddler arrived and was entertained in the kitchen, and by late afternoon, carts and carriages and riders on horseback came up to the door of the inn. There was a feast spread on the table in the long room, and when people assembled for it, the whole inn seemed to be blazing with beauty and good cheer. Then the longed-for hour came. The guests gathered in the passage, ready to go up the stairs with the fiddler leading them. Cinnamon John came behind the fiddler, holding by the hand his pretty 16-year-old daughter, whose rustling silk dress had come from Persia. Mr. Toppin was next, with the hand of Cinnamon John's wife in his. She was plump and short, he was big and brawny, but merriment made them a pair. So on up the stairs came the crowd, with the fiddler playing rollicking sea tunes through the open door and into the room. Jared, standing by the door with a knot of smaller children, watched it all with the comfort of invisibility given by youth. Praise mounted from white throats, roared from bearded lips as the stenciled walls were seen. Laughter rang and approval boomed. Then the fiddler took his place, tucked his fiddle more closely under his chin, and his music swirled over the crowd like the waves of the frieze. When the fiddler stopped, voices echoed in the room, while the music still hung lightly on the air. "A cheer for Mr. Toppin! For Mr. Toppin!" Cinnamon John cried out, raising his husky arm high. "A cheer for Mr. Toppin!" cried the merrymakers. Mr. Toppin lifted his hand. "One moment, ladies and gentlemen." He broke through the crowd and went toward the doorway where the children clustered. There was such silence in the room that the flickering of candles seemed almost like the sound. Mr. Toppin stopped before his apprentice, and with a sweep of his great arm drew the boy into the center of the room. He smiled at the people. "A cheer for Mr. Toppin is not enough," he said. "A cheer for Mr. Toppin and his apprentice it must be." A shout led by Cinnamon John went up from the crowd, and Jared, feeling the comfortable weight of Mr. Toppin's strong hand on his shoulder, stood tall. He could forget his ill-fitting suit of coarse homespun cloth, with the bits of paint on it here and there. He could forget, too, the icy wind that had blown across his life and made him shiver even when the sun was high. For here was warmth, joy like a fire that he could hold his hands to, and beauty like a bright flame. He smiled into the friendly faces and then looked up at Mr. Toppin. "We had a good time working on these walls, didn't we, sir?" he said in a whisper. "That we did, Jared. They're but the first of many," Mr. Toppin answered. He gave the boy's shoulder a pat and turned him toward the door. We've an early start to make in the morning, so go you to your bed soon." Jared nodded and started wending his way through the crowd back to the group of children. They were growing heavy-eyed, and the head of the littlest one drooped with sleep. Jared herded them together like a tired flock down the stairs, through the kitchen with its lingering aroma of spice, up the steep back stairs to the loft. The children were wordless in their weariness and readily sought their beds under the eaves, crawling into them with boots and clothes that would have stayed on had not Jared helped them to change. Finally, the room was still, save for the breathing of the children. In the distance, almost as if in another world, was the lilt of music and the soft sound of voices that were music in themselves. The night was warm, and Jared lay on the bed without drawing the quilt over him. The moon threw a silver cloak across his shoulders, and before it was withdrawn he was asleep. There was little stir in the inn the next morning when Cinnamon John gave Mr. Toppin and his apprentice their breakfast. Guests who had remained overnight were still abed, and even Cinnamon John's wife and children were asleep. While the silver dollars were being counted out, Jared went for the horses, heaving all his strength into securing the saddle girths around their fat bellies. He led them to the doorstep of the inn. The brown mare neighed with eagerness when she saw her master, for she too was used to the road, to like the pasture for long. The gray one, to whom everything was still so new, pricked up her ears and pawed the earth with an impatient forefoot. Cinnamon John put his hand on Jared's shoulder and looked up at Mr. Toppin. "Toppin," he said, "I've done my best, but I haven't put a mite of flesh on the boy these weeks he's been with us." "No one can say you haven't tried," Toppin answered, taking the mare's bridle and swinging his big body lightly into the saddle. Jared thought of the breads and beans and puddings that had come from the oven, of the great roasts from the spit, and the tasty stews from the iron kettle. "I never knew food could be so good," he said apologetically for his thinness. Then he turned and swung his leg over the saddle. "Good's one thing and useful's another," Cinnamon John muttered. "I'd like to see some flesh on your bones." "He's not made to get heavy, John," Mr. Toppin said consolingly. "Some folks have heart, and some have body, and some have both. I'm not worrying about a lad with heart. We'll be back one day. Goodbye for now." The horses were moving ahead, Jared urging the gray one to keep pace with the mare. "You'll find no better welcome anywhere," Cinnamon John called after them, his voice deep in his throat. Then he turned into his kitchen to stir up the fire for his guests. They were off, and the road reached long before them, winding and mysterious. "Where are we going now, Mr. Toppin?" Jared asked. "I don't know, boy. Some place where people want what we can give."